They only noticed I was gone when the bills arrived with no one left to pay them. Funny how a household can feel full, busy, loud, demanding. Yet the person holding it together can disappear without anyone realizing she was ever carrying the weight. For 5 years I kept the light steady, the water warm, the cable running, the Wi-Fi strong. I knew every due date by heart, every password by instinct, every quiet crisis before it could become loud. And because everything worked, everyone assumed it always would. I wasn't the head of the family. I wasn't the loudest voice. I wasn't even the one people thanked at dinner. I was the background rhythm, the invisible system, keeping everything moving while life happened around me. At first I told myself it was love, then responsibility, then habit, then something harder to name. But households have a way of revealing their truths. It started small. A bill I didn't authorize. A password I didn't change. A family photo posted with a caption that didn't include me. Then the moment that broke the last quiet peace inside me. I was not invited to a child's birthday I had paid for 3 years in a row. There's a particular silence that hits you when you realize you've disappeared in plain sight. And there's a particular strength that rises the moment you decide you won't stay invisible anymore. This is the story of how I quietly, calmly, and fully stepped back. How the home that ran on my labor confronted its own weight, and how I found myself again in the stillness that followed. If you want more stories like this, quiet, emotional, and deeply human, make sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next one. I didn't mean for it to become a system, just a favor, something small enough to fold into the quiet rhythm of a Tuesday evening. I sat at the kitchen table, the warm light soft on my hands, and opened the utility apps one by one. Electricity, water, internet, cable, insurance. Each window bloomed with its own little reminder of responsibility, and I clicked auto-pay the way some people smooth a wrinkle on a bedsheet, not for praise, but for peace. The house hummed around me, steady and familiar, and for a moment I felt steadier too, like keeping the lights on meant I could hold the world still. My breath evened, my fingers remembered the motions on their own. It was a small choreography no one asked for but everyone relied on, a kind of love that doesn't need applause. Or maybe that's what I told myself so it didn't sting later. When the printers at the shop finally went silent that night, I stayed behind to print the household statements. The pages slid out warm, still carrying the faint smell of ink. I clipped them neatly into a clear plastic sleeve and set the binder on the counter beside the stove. It wasn't impressive to anyone else, just white paper, black ink, the math of living. But order has always calmed me. I liked knowing that if a storm hit, if the power flickered, if someone misplaced a password again, there would be a clean trail back to certainty. I whispered, "For the peace of the house," partly joking, partly not. There's a strange comfort in doing things no one remembers but everyone depends on, like straightening a rug or wiping a spill no one saw. Mom walked in as I was closing the binder. She smiled the way mothers do when they think something is sweet but unnecessary. "You're so thoughtful. Makes life easier for everyone," she said. Her voice was warm, but the word easier nudged something small inside me, like my effort was a soft background noise, pleasant but invisible. Still, I nodded, matching her smile. Love doesn't need recognition, I reminded myself, though sometimes it aches anyway. I washed my hands, the kitchen light soft above us, her footsteps fading down the hall while mine remained still. I didn't always carry the bills. It started years ago, during a hurricane season when the power cut out twice in 1 week. I thought handling the logistics might help, keep stress from piling on the dining table alongside unopened envelopes. I remember thinking, if I take care of the groundwork long enough, eventually someone will notice. Not in a dramatic way, just a simple acknowledgement, a hand on the shoulder, a "thanks for remembering." But people get used to comfort quickly. They stop tracing where it came from, and little by little, the offering becomes the expectation.
I didn't see that part coming. Standing at the sink, I rinsed the plates, letting the warm dishwasher steam wrap around my arms. The faint smell of diluted soap rose like something familiar and tired. The water had its steady song, rushing, swirling, settling. It reminded me of all the things that make a home run without applause. The towels washed, the trash taken out, the accounts updated before anyone feels the consequences. These were the sounds of a life smoothly running, but also the sounds of someone disappearing behind it. When I turned, the kitchen light held steady above me, warm, golden, unwavering. It cast a soft glow over the table, the binder, the quiet proof of things done without being asked. I paused, letting the stillness settle. That light would become something else later, brighter, harsher, clearer. But for now, it was just gentle. A motif waiting for its meaning. A reminder that even the simplest bulbs hum with a truth you don't notice until it flickers. By 6 a.m, the house was still dark except for the bluish glow of my phone screen. I sat at the kitchen table with yesterday's cup still faintly smelling of coffee and opened my banking app.
A column of green check marks lined up like obedient soldiers. Utilities, insurance, cable, the quiet architecture of a functioning home. I scrolled through each line, cross-referencing it with the list I kept on a notepad beside me. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was exact, familiar. My fingers tapped without hesitation, moving through tabs the same way you might straighten silverware without thinking. Outside, a dumpster truck groaned down the street, and inside, the gentle hum of the refrigerator filled the silence I'd grown comfortable in. Routine has its own mercy. It asks nothing of you, except that you keep coming back. Before leaving for the print shop, I adjusted the due dates for a few payments so they wouldn't land too close to payroll week. Cash flow spikes and dips like a temperamental tide, and you learn to ride it lightly. With one hand holding the work calendar and the other sliding digital bars across the screen, I shifted utilities into calmer pockets of the month. The precision soothed me. You can't control many things, but you can control when a bill clears. I sipped the bitter tail end of yesterday's coffee, knowing it would be the last peaceful moment of the day, and slid my phone into my bag as the kitchen light finally woke up above me, soft and patient. My brother wandered in mid-stretch, blinking at me through sleep. "You pay attention to such tiny stuff," he said, half teasing, half dismissive. The way someone comments on the weather when they don't really want to talk. I smiled into my cup. "Yeah," I answered lightly. "Tiny stuff keeps the house from falling apart." He laughed, not unkindly, but not understanding either. There are roles that become so second nature people forget their roles at all. When he poured himself cereal and left the carton open, I closed it without thinking. That's the nature of invisible tasks. They're done before anyone notices they needed doing. But tiny stuff is what keeps a family running on quiet wheels. The trash taken out before it smells. The car insurance renewed before it lapses. The service fees caught before they grow claws. People assume these things happen automatically, like rain or sunrise. I used to correct them gently. Someone actually did that. But the corrections fell flat over time, so I stopped. Transparency doesn't matter to people who only like the results. I rinsed the mug in the sink, thinking how odd it is that the smallest duties become the heaviest when no one sees you carrying them. The morning's first sip of new coffee hit my tongue, stronger and more certain, cutting through the quiet with a kind of clarity only bitterness can bring. I leaned against the counter and inhaled the steam, feeling the warmth settle into my chest. A day full of deadlines waited for me, but this brief ceremony, just me, the mug, and the slow bloom of heat, was mine. No one could minimize it, claim it, or forget it. In a house where everything I did evaporated into expectation, this one small thing stayed rooted. A private reminder that feeling grounded didn't have to depend on anyone else's acknowledgement. Before heading out, I opened the binder on the counter and updated each page with a quick tap of my pen. Paid. 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 The ink dried instantly, leaving neat diagonals across the corners. Somewhere along the years, I realized each checkmark erased me a little more from the conversation. The smoother the household ran, the less I existed within it. Funny how efficiency turns into erasure if no one bothers to look at the hands behind it. I closed the binder, slid it neatly into its slot beside the fridge, and grabbed my keys. The house was quiet, functioning, and entirely unaware of the person who kept it that way. By late afternoon, I found myself reorganizing the drawer where we kept every important scrap of domestic life. Receipts, warranties, old invoices, each one flattened and lined up like soldiers waiting for inspection. I liked the order of it. The clean edges, the reassurance that nothing was hiding where it shouldn't be. I sorted by date, then by category, checking balances one more time even though I already knew they matched. There's a strange comfort in reconfirming your own competence, a way of reminding yourself that even if no one else sees the seams you're stitching together, the fabric still holds because of you. I inhaled the faint scent of old paper and lemony cleaner and kept working, letting the repetition settle my nerves. Quiet jobs have a way of absorbing unease. You focus on the lines, and the world becomes bearable again. In the middle of the neat rows, a single internet bill stood out, folded twice instead of once, the crease cutting the page into uneven thirds. I unfolded it, expecting the usual numbers. Instead, a new charge stared back at me. An added sports package. I blinked. We'd never subscribed to it. The total was higher by enough to catch my breath. Not ruin us, but enough to whisper that someone had made a decision with my money without asking. The paper felt strangely heavier between my fingers, as if the extra fee had weight. I turned it over, checking for a note, a signature, anything that might explain the change. There was nothing. Just a quiet assumption that the increase didn't matter because I was the one paying. I took a picture of the bill and typed a short message to the family group chat. Did someone upgrade the internet package? I need to adjust the accounts. Simple. Neutral. Professional. 3 dots appeared. Pulsed. Disappeared. Then nothing. Silence stretched in the digital room where we shared meal plans and birthday reminders, but apparently not financial decisions. I sent a second message. Please confirm. Still nothing. It's funny how people grow loud with opinions until the topic involves responsibility. My phone buzzed with other notifications, promotions, spam, shipping updates, but not a single acknowledgement from the people who actually lived under the same roof. The absence felt louder than any answer. I set the bill down and felt the edge catch the side of my index finger. A thin, stinging line bloomed across the skin, sharp, quick, almost too small to matter. I pressed the pad of my thumb over it until the sting dulled. Paper cuts never bleed much, but they linger. They remind you that even soft things can hurt when handled carelessly. Maybe the bill wasn't meant to wound, but the quiet presumption behind it did. I stood there a moment, letting the pain settle into something I could understand, something I could name. Maybe this was the first real sign that something had shifted. I clipped the double-folded bill to the front of the binder, red clip top corner, so it wouldn't get lost in the stack of neat, obedient papers. A silent flag. A private warning. I didn't announce it to anyone, didn't raise my voice or posture for attention. I simply placed it where I'd know to look again. There's power in observation before action. I had learned that from years of managing things no one else kept track of. I tapped the binder once, closed the drawer slowly, and stood in the stillness of my own awareness. Something was beginning, even if they didn't see it yet. Dinner was simple that night. Nothing fancy, just roasted vegetables, a pan of chicken, and the clock ticking above us like a quiet metronome. I set the table while listening to the familiar sounds of a house settling into evening. When everyone gathered, Mom began her usual rundown of what the house needed. The gutters checked, the AC filter replaced, the cable acting up again. "You understand, right?" she said, as though I'd always been the designated keeper of unglamorous chores. I nodded, though the acknowledgement felt thinner than it used to. My fork hovered above my plate. I could feel the kitchen's warmth on my skin, the comfort of routine brushing against a tension I didn't want to name yet. My brother stabbed a carrot and grinned. "Hey, you're the best at pushing the right buttons," he joked, waving his fork like a conductor's baton. The words landed playfully, but the implication hit differently now, like my role was a button too, one that everyone pressed without thinking. I kept my tone level. "I'm best at pressing them on time," I said, the calmness surprising even me. My voice didn't rise or fall. It just existed. Neutral. Unbothered on the surface. A kind of steadiness that comes right before a shift. Their laughter faded, and for a moment I drifted back to the first night they asked me to help, just for a few months, just until things stabilized. Back then, the request felt like trust, almost gratitude. I'd believed that if I took care of enough small things, the larger things would feel lighter for everyone. I hadn't realized the favor had silently rewritten itself into obligation. The chicken on my plate cooled faster than I expected. The room smelled of rosemary and faint oil, but something underneath it felt heavier. The realization that I'd stepped into a role no one ever planned to hand back. The pan on the stove still held the sheen of cooling grease, its surface darkening as the heat slipped away. I watched it from the table, remembering how often I rinsed pans after midnight because no one else thought to. It struck me suddenly how quickly warmth evaporates from metal, and how quickly appreciation evaporates from routine. I chewed slowly, each bite more about buying time than enjoying the food. The evening air felt thick, like the space between their expectations and my boundaries had finally stopped pretending to be harmless. I set my fork down gently, pressing the metal into the wood just enough to anchor my hand. The conversation continued around me, requests, reminders, casual dismissals of effort, but I didn't follow. I listened to the room instead. The clatter of silverware, a chair creaking, a glass being lifted. Ordinary sounds, but they carried a different meaning now, as if every familiar noise was revealing the imbalance I'd been too forgiving to notice. I wasn't angry. I wasn't hurt. Not yet. I was simply awake to the weight I'd been carrying on one shoulder for years. Just before clearing the plates, I let my hands rest in my lap, completely still. A small act, almost invisible, but it felt like placing a stone on a new foundation. The house buzzed in its usual patterns, unaware that the balance had shifted a fraction, just enough for me to feel it in my spine. As I stood and gathered the dishes, I inhaled deeply, letting the warmth of the kitchen settle around me. I didn't say anything more. I didn't need to. Something in me had quietly decided to start paying attention. And once you begin noticing, you can't go back to not seeing. The next morning, the cable bill came through with another increase, this time for a children's channel bundle. I stared at the new total, the number climbing higher with the same casualness someone might use to toss a toy onto an already full shelf. It wasn't the money itself that caught me off guard, but the quiet confidence behind the change. Someone had assumed I would absorb it without question, the way I always had, like a sponge pressed under a dripping faucet. I sat at the kitchen table, the early light breaking gently over the surface, and scrolled through the previous month's charges. Each line told a story of additions I never asked for. I felt the realization settle into my chest. Not a sharp stab, just a slow tightening, like a drawstring being pulled. I opened my banking app and shifted a few due dates again to compensate for the increased cable amount. The actions were fluid, practiced. I'd done them enough times to navigate without thinking. But today, there was a small drag in my wrist, a hesitation I hadn't felt before. I adjusted the utility payment, Then the phone bill. Creating space for this new charge someone else had decided I would cover. My fingers hovered over the screen for a moment. Reorganizing numbers felt different now. Not like caretaking, but like rearranging furniture someone else kept moving behind my back. I closed the app and let my phone rest on the table, screen down. My sister-in-law appeared in the doorway, tying her hair up as she spoke. "Oh, by the way, can you make sure the New Kids channels stay on the auto-pay list? Noah really likes them." She said it lightly, almost sweetly, the way someone might remind you to pick up napkins before a picnic. I nodded, but inside, her phrasing lodged somewhere deeper than she intended. Make sure. Remember. Keep paying. The request wasn't a question. It was a directive, resting on the assumption that I was the household's financial autopilot. I stirred sugar into my coffee, the spoon tapping the mug with a rhythmic patience, and let her words dissolve into the room. 5 years. That's how long I've been keeping everything afloat, smoothing out every bump, catching every oversight, patching every hole before anyone else noticed the floorboards creaking. 5 years of being the quiet system behind the louder lives around me. They weren't cruel. They weren't malicious. They were simply used to the house running without friction, without missed payments, without consequences. And I had been the buffer. But buffers wear thin eventually. I felt that truth graze me for the first time as I rinsed my mug in the sink, watching the water swirl down in a small whirlpool that looked too much like effort going unnoticed. I opened the plastic binder and flipped to the cable tab. The page crinkled slightly under my thumb, the smell of the plastic sleeve sharp and synthetic. I traced the rising totals from the past year, small increases that stacked like bricks until they became a wall. My pen hovered above the margin. Usually, I'd just adjust the next paycheck. Stretch myself a bit thinner. Tell myself it was temporary. But today, the numbers looked like something else. A line, being crossed in pencil, but felt in ink. I exhaled slowly and closed the binder halfway, letting the weight of it rest against my hands. For the first time in years, I placed a small star in the margin next to the cable bill, a mark no one else would see, but one that meant more to me than the ink suggested. A private signal, a reminder that I didn't need to keep absorbing everything unquestioningly. I held the binder for another moment before sliding it back onto the shelf, its plastic cover catching the light. The morning felt different, charged with a quiet awareness I hadn't allowed myself before. As I stepped away from the counter, I knew the weight of the house was shifting, subtly, but unmistakably. By the time the holiday season crept in, the print shop was running at full speed, orders stacked, machines whirred, and the air smelled like warm toner and cardboard dust. I checked our accounts twice that morning, calculating how much cash flow we needed to stay steady through the rush. When I got home, I stood at the kitchen counter and typed a message to the family group chat. Holiday workload is heavy this month. I need to balance payments carefully. I hit send, not expecting help, just transparency. Clarity felt safer now. I looked around the kitchen, still smelling faintly of cinnamon from earlier baking, and thought how often I'd prioritized everyone else's comfort over my own stability. This season the math mattered. So did the boundaries. The binder lay open on the table, as if waiting for me. I pulled out the red pen I rarely used. It felt too sharp, too official for the soft domesticity the family preferred. But today, I slid it beside me and opened the tab for utilities. Notes cluttered the margins from previous months. Small adjustments, reminders, quiet concessions. My brother leaned on the doorway, eyebrows knit. "Don't bring money stress into the house," he said, like I'd walked in carrying storm clouds under my coat. I lifted my eyes from the page. His tone wasn't cruel, but it was dismissive enough to land. I looked back to the binder, letting his comment settle where it belonged, not over my decisions, just over the moment. For years I believed love meant prepaying peace for everyone else, solving problems before they surfaced, smoothing bills before they wrinkled. But now the thought tasted different. Maybe love wasn't about erasing friction, Maybe it was about making sure I didn't vanish in the process. I set the binder flat and drew a clean line beneath the last entry, a small moment of realignment. The air felt cooler when I inhaled, a sign of something shifting inside me. Awareness has a way of lighting corners you didn't know were dim. As I stood to grab a glass of water, the kitchen light flickered once, barely noticeable, just a soft blink that slipped across the walls. It steadied itself, glowing warm again, but the brief pulse felt like a whisper. A reminder that even bulbs show strain before they burn out. I held the glass under the tap, listening to the water rush with a clarity I hadn't felt all week. The house hummed its usual tune, but I sensed the slight, undeniable tremor beneath it. Something small, something early, like the first crack forming under too much weight. I returned to the table and opened a password manager on my phone, reviewing recovery emails and security settings linked to the household accounts. I had updated them countless times, always quietly, always for convenience. But convenience for others had turned into vulnerability for me. I typed a note to myself, review access, review control, and saved it to a folder no one else knew existed. My hand hovered over the screen before locking the phone. It felt like a soft warning to my future self. Begin paying attention now, not later. Before closing the binder, I wrote 2 calm words in the margin. Soft alert. Not a threat, not a declaration, just a private acknowledgement that something needed watching. The red ink looked almost too bright against the white paper, a pulse on the page. I shut the binder slowly, feeling the faint texture of its plastic cover beneath my fingertips. The house was quiet when I exhaled, but not the same kind of quiet it used to be. This silence held possibility, an early signal that change doesn't arrive loudly. It starts as a tremor you can only feel if you've finally stopped ignoring it. Dad was flipping through channels when I walked into the living room, the glow of the TV bouncing softly off his glasses. He didn't look up as he said, almost proudly, "This family runs itself pretty well, doesn't it?" His voice held that comfortable certainty people get when they've never watched a bill come due. I stood behind the couch for a moment, absorbing the comment like someone holding a cup that suddenly feels too hot. He wasn't being unkind. He was simply stating a truth he believed, that the house maintained itself, that the wheels turned on their own. I opened my mouth to reply but found no words that didn't feel like pleading, so I stayed quiet. The room felt steady, warm even, but something inside me recoiled at the implication that my work had evaporated into thin air. Later, the group chat dinged with a dozen photos from a weekend project they'd done together. Hanging lights in the backyard, setting up a small fire pit, a caption under one picture, "All hands on deck." They tagged each other, even the neighbor who only stopped by for 10 minutes. But not me. I stared at the screen, waiting for my name to appear somewhere, maybe in a comment, maybe in a casual acknowledgement. Nothing. The omission was too clean, too familiar. I typed, "Looks great," then deleted the exclamation point. 3 plain words. Neutral, distant, alone on a line. I pressed send and set the phone face down, watching the quiet settle over the kitchen. Something in my chest dipped. Not a dramatic plunge, just a subtle sinking, like the floor lowering half an inch beneath me. I felt it as I stirred the pot on the stove, the tomato sauce thickening into a slow simmer. I moved the spoon in slow circles, listening to the small pops as bubbles rose and burst. The smell of the sauce, rich, warm, a little sweet, filled the kitchen, but even that comfort didn't ease the hollow feeling. Maybe it was the contrast, the fullness of the scent against the emptiness of being omitted. I reached over to turn the flame down, catching myself hesitating longer than normal, as if waiting for someone to call my name. After dinner, I opened the drawer where I kept the binder and placed it inside, sliding it back until it clicked softly against the rear panel. The binder fit perfectly, as if the drawer had been made for it. I had always found that satisfying. But tonight, closing it felt like hiding a part of myself. A piece of labor so invisible it might as well dissolve once the drawer shut. I ran my hand along the wooden edge, feeling the grain beneath my fingertips, grounding myself in something real. The house around me murmured with familiar sounds, yet none of them carried my name. Not in any way that mattered. Standing there in the dim kitchen, I realized I felt unanchored in my own home. Not excluded loudly, not pushed away in anger, just quietly left out, erased by oversight rather than intention. And sometimes that kind of forgetting hurts in a sharper way. It's difficult to resent people who don't mean harm, but it's harder not to feel the wound of being unseen. I exhaled slowly, letting the weight of the day slip down my spine. The room stayed still, as if holding its breath with me. I closed the drawer fully, the sound soft but final. The loss wasn't catastrophic, just a small tear along the edge of something I had long thought was whole. A fragile rip that didn't announce itself but changed the shape of the page anyway. I turned off the kitchen light and stood for a moment in the low glow drifting from the hallway. The silence felt both heavy and clarifying. I wasn't angry. I wasn't broken. But I wasn't untouched either. Something in me had shifted just enough to feel the imbalance. And once you feel it, you can't unfeel it. The email came in while I was wiping down the kitchen counter, its notification banner sliding across my phone like a quiet tap on the shoulder. I opened it without thinking. Another household bill, I assumed. But the sender's address looked wrong. The account email had been changed. At first, I thought I'd mistyped something months ago, or maybe a glitch had pushed an update through. But when I tried logging in, the system told me the password had been reset recently. I typed it again, slower this time. Same result. I stood still, dish towel in hand, the soft smell of citrus cleaner rising between us. Someone had taken access to the account, the one I'd managed for years, and replaced my name with theirs. No warning, no conversation, just a quiet overwrite. I walked to the table and set the phone down, its screen glowing with a firmness that didn't match the uneasiness gathering in my stomach. For a few seconds I watched the login error blink at me like a small accusation. You don't belong here anymore. I checked the recovery email, also changed. My fingers went cold in a way the room didn't justify. I took a breath and typed a message into the family group chat. Who updated the account information for internet billing? My hands were sleeping. My hands were steady, but my chest wasn't. The dots appeared, flickered, disappeared. Then nothing. The silence felt too deliberate to be accidental. I tried again. Please confirm who changed the email and password. Still nothing. The unanswered space around the message felt heavier than the question itself. I sat down at the table, letting the edges of the wood press lightly into my palms. There's a kind of quiet that doesn't soothe, it tightens. That's what's wrapped around me now. Losing access wasn't just inconvenient, it was symbolic. It was my voice being edited out, my role being emptied while the work still expected me to show up. The dishwasher clicked behind me as it cooled, each sound unnervingly sharp. I realized I wasn't upset about the bill. I was upset about what it meant, that someone had taken the reins without asking, assuming I'd still pull the wagon somehow from behind. In the hallway, I heard the refrigerator door close, a solid thump that echoed down the quiet house. It made me think of all the times I'd kept the home running through storms, outages, emergencies. Always the one with the passwords, the patience, the plan. I had never asked for recognition, but I hadn't expected erasure either. The sound lingered like a punctuation mark at the end of a sentence I didn't want to read. I rubbed the heel of my hand over my sternum, trying to ease the tension there. The air felt heavier, as if the house itself understood before its occupants did.
My phone buzzed 3 times on the table, 3 short vibrations spaced evenly apart. I watched it without picking it up. It stopped abruptly, leaving the room in a stillness that felt too deliberate. I finally turned the phone over, expecting a response from the family chat. But it wasn't them. It was a promotional text, a shipping update, and a calendar reminder. Not one message from the people who had changed the account behind my back. A small laugh escaped me, not amused, but disbelieving. 3 buzzes, 0 answers. The imbalance was becoming impossible to ignore. I pressed my palms flat against the tabletop and let the cool surface steady me. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't storm through the house demanding explanations. Instead, I breathed slowly, letting the realization settle the way dust does after a quiet collapse.
Something unspoken had shifted, and not in my favor. Their silence wasn't an oversight, it was a choice. And choices, even small ones, reveal truths people don't want to say out loud. I picked up my phone, locked the screen, and set it down again. For the first time in years, I felt the distance between what I did for this house and what this house believed about me. The photo showed up while I was refilling the ice tray, one of those family snapshots taken in the backyard, everyone smiling in coordinated warmth. Someone had captioned it, "Our team handles everything ourselves." I stared at the words, letting the cold from the ice tray bleed into my fingers. Ourselves. The claim felt strangely bold considering how many of those smiles had been held up by the scaffolding I'd spent years maintaining. The picture was bright, full of laughter, but the sentence beneath it dimmed something inside me. They all looked so proud, so united, so self-sufficient, so untouched by the labor they no longer remembered I did. The omission was clean, almost elegant in its carelessness. A private message from my sister-in-law followed, short, clipped. Don't read too much into it. I read it once, twice, then set the phone down on the counter. It wasn't anger that rose in me. It was a mild, cooling disappointment, like stepping into a room you thought would be warm. I typed back slowly. I only asked about access to the bills. No extra words, no softened tone. My fingers hovered before I hit send, just long enough to confirm I wasn't overstepping. I pressed the button and watched the message deliver without hesitation. Her reply never came. I took a screenshot of the original post, then another of my message thread, saving each into a digital folder I'd started without really meaning to. A ledger of sorts. A quiet archive of small moments that were starting to matter. It wasn't about collecting proof. It was about collecting clarity. Each saved screenshot felt like grounding, like marking coordinates before the ground shifted again. The kitchen tile beneath my feet felt cooler than usual, a reminder that even familiar floors can feel foreign when you realize you're standing on them alone. The refrigerator hummed behind me as I scrolled through the rest of the comments under the photo. Inside jokes, casual gratitude, a lot of, "Love this," but nothing that reflected the reality I lived every billing cycle. I stopped scrolling when I felt the first tug of emotional fatigue. There's a specific kind of tired that comes from being erased from a narrative you helped build. It doesn't shout, it sinks. I leaned against the counter and let the quiet stretch around me, thick and unmoving. The photo stayed open on my screen until I finally locked it away. I walked back to the table, feeling the cool air brush across my ankles. The kitchen, usually comforting, felt strangely sharpened, its edges clearer, its silences louder. I pulled out a notebook and wrote down the time, the link, and the caption exactly as it appeared. Clinical. Detached. Not because I feared forgetting, but because I wanted to see the truth as plainly as possible. There's so much power in confronting what people show you, not what you hope they meant. The pen moved steadily across the page, each stroke steadier than how my chest felt. When I closed the notebook, I sat for a moment, with my hands resting lightly on the cover. The house around me continued its usual rhythm. The low hum of appliances, the distant thud of someone upstairs, the faint rustle of leaves outside the window. But I no longer felt woven into those sounds, not fully. Something had shifted in the way I saw the home, and the way it saw me, or didn't. I took one last deep breath, exhaled slowly, and let the weight settle without resisting it. Sometimes clarity arrives quietly, like light under a doorframe. And once it touches you, you don't go back to darkness willingly. Hi everyone. The kitchen was quiet at midday, sunlight stretching across the counter in a pale stripe. I was reviewing invoices from the shop when the overhead light clicked on by itself, an automatic setting I'd forgotten I programmed months ago. It used to reassure me, that steady glow marking each part of the day. But now, the unexpected brightness felt almost intrusive, as if the house were drawing attention to something I wasn't ready to name. I set my pen down and looked straight at the open binder on the table, its pages fanned like a deck of cards waiting for the next move. The realization hit me softly but unmistakably. I had been paying for more than utilities. I'd been paying for silence, for harmony, for belonging, and none of those things were being returned. I picked up my phone and typed a brief message into the group chat, measured, calm, without apology. I need access restored for all household accounts. Please reinstate my email and login. I read it twice, ensuring it held no emotion they could dismiss. It wasn't a plea. It was a boundary, a request shaped like a line they weren't used to seeing me draw. I hit send. No exclamation, no softening. My thumb lingered over the screen as if expecting an immediate reply, but nothing came. Only the quiet certainty that I had spoken clearly, maybe for the first time in years. My notebooks, receipts, and screenshots remained scattered across the table. I looked at them not as burdens, but as evidence of how much I'd shouldered. Somewhere along the years, I had paid for more than just services. I had paid for the privilege of being overlooked. That truth settled coldly, like a coin dropped into water. I ran my fingers along the edges of the binder, feeling the grooves and ridges of a role I had outgrown. A small ache rose in my chest, not grief, not anger, just the recognition of a truth I could no longer ignore. Dust floated lazily through the beam of light, drifting like tiny salt crystals suspended in the air. The stillness gave me space to think in a way I hadn't allowed myself before. My eyes moved to the seat across from me, the same chair where I'd spent nights adjusting budgets, rerouting payments, and smoothing over the gaps left by others. For years I'd believed that managing everything was the only way to keep the family stable. But the more I stared now, the clearer it became. The stability had cost me my presence in the very house I uphold. The light overhead spread across the cool surface of the table, softening the harsh angles of receipts and pens, casting everything in a warm wash that felt different than before. It didn't comfort me, it exposed things, especially the emptiness of the seat beside me. I thought of all the versions of myself who had sat there unquestioningly, folding responsibility into affection, thinking it was the same thing. I exhaled through the tension lingering in my lungs. I wasn't invisible because I failed to speak. I was invisible because they learned to stop listening. I stood up, moved a few papers into a neat stack, and closed the binder with a gentle but certain grip. The light didn't flicker this time, it held steady, bright without wavering, as if acknowledging something was shifting in return. I walked to the sink, rinsed my hands under cool water, and let the clarity run through me in the same even flow. When I turned back, the kitchen was unchanged, but I wasn't. Something in me had turned over, like a page ready for its first word. And that, I knew, was the beginning of a different kind of choice. The message from my sister-in-law arrived late morning, sharp as a pebble skimming across still water. "You're being too tense. Don't make everything revolve around money." I stared at the words, letting them sit in the center of the screen until they blurred slightly. The kitchen was warm from the oven preheating, the faint scent of lemon from the dish soap rising as I rinsed a bowl. I wiped my hands on a towel and replied without giving myself room to soften the edges. "It's not about money. It's about decisions made with my money." The clarity of that sentence steadied me. I could almost hear the silence growing on the other end, thick, hesitant, maybe defensive, or maybe uninterested. Silence, I'd learned, has different textures depending on who's holding it. I placed the binder on the counter and pressed the red pen cap back into place, feeling the soft click resonate in my hand. The room around me felt still, almost too still, like the air was weighed down by everything unspoken. I wasn't trembling. I wasn't anxious. My voice, typed or spoken, felt firmly anchored for the first time in a long stretch of years. I repeated the sentence aloud just to hear it in the air. "It's about decisions made with my money." The words didn't echo. They simply filled the room evenly. Truth rarely needs to be raised to be heard. It only needs to be said plainly. I closed the binder, stacking the pages neatly before sliding it aside. For years, I had let misunderstandings linger because correcting them felt like stirring water already settling. But I understood now. Clarity isn't conflict. It's alignment. Necessary, healthy, even kind in its own way. I leaned against the counter, feeling the cool surface at my back. The tension between my ribs loosened slightly, like something inside me had been unlatched. The silence from the family chat wasn't surprising, but it stopped bruising the way it used to. I had named the imbalance, and naming it shifted the weight off my chest. A damp dishcloth hung over the sink edge, its faint citrus scent rising as the steam from the faucet thinned in the air. The smell reminded me of all the little domestic rituals I'd tended quietly. Things no one noticed unless they went undone. I inhaled deeply, letting the scent settle in my lungs. For years, I had interpreted love as preemptive effort, fixing, smoothing, anticipating, but the past days had shown me something uncomfortable. Love, without boundaries, becomes erasure. And erasure, when sustained long enough, becomes resentment. Not loud, not dramatic. Just quiet sediment building at the bottom of the heart. I opened my phone again and set a reminder titled, "Pause before paying." It wasn't an ultimatum. It wasn't revenge. It was a promise. To myself, for myself. A gentle checkpoint. A boundary drawn not with anger but with self-respect. The alert landed in my calendar with a soft chime, the kind that didn't startle but affirmed. I took a slow breath, feeling the sound settle into me like a small, decisive step forward. This was not about confrontation. It was about reclaiming my place in decisions that affected my life and my bank account. Before leaving the kitchen, I added one final note to the binder in small, precise handwriting. Financial responsibility requires shared responsibility. No flourish, no underline. Just a quiet truth placed where I could see it if the days grew muddy again. I slid the binder into the drawer and listened to the soft thud of it settling into place. The room was warm, the light steady. I wasn't seeking approval anymore. I wasn't hoping they would suddenly understand. Understanding might come later, or it might not. But my clarity was already here, and it felt firm beneath my feet. The notification arrived just as I was pulling a chilled cake box from the refrigerator. A yearly ritual so familiar it felt almost ceremonial. The message preview was short, cheerful, and unmistakably excluding. Noah's birthday tonight, just close family. I blinked at the screen, waiting for my name to appear somewhere in the thread. A follow-up, a correction, a clarification. None came. The silence beneath the sentence felt as deliberate as the words themselves. I set the cake on the counter, the cool air brushing against my wrists, and opened the full message. My name wasn't missing by accident. It wasn't missing because of space or confusion. It was missing because someone had chosen to remove it. I whispered a small, flat, "okay," into the empty kitchen, though no one was there to hear. I typed back, "Got it," keeping the tone even. No question marks, no disappointment tucked between words. The message sent instantly, a neat blue bubble that looked far more composed than I felt. I closed the conversation and stared at the cake. Vanilla layers, smooth icing, the kind of quiet sweetness I'd picked every year without fail. It looked strangely out of place now, like a gesture pointed at a door that had just closed. For a moment, my fingers tightened around the cardboard edge of the box. Then I released it, letting the breath I'd been holding slip out slowly. I wasn't angry. I was simply acknowledging. With the refrigerator door still open, cold air spilled out in a soft gust, brushing against my face. The cake sat there, perfectly intact, perfectly unnecessary. I reached in and lifted it back onto the shelf, the chilled surface of the box stiff beneath my palms. My reflection wavered against the stainless steel, small, blurred, almost unfamiliar. I stood still, letting the cold settle into my skin longer than needed, as if the chill could flatten the hollow feeling expanding in my chest. Moments like these aren't loud. They're quiet cuts you feel only when you stop moving long enough to notice the sting. I closed the fridge and leaned my forehead lightly against the door, letting the cool surface ground me. Above the counter, a birthday card I'd bought earlier that week lay propped against a jar. Bright, colorful, chosen with care. I picked it up and read the front again, though I'd memorized the words the moment I bought it. It felt weightless now, its purpose undone with a single text message. I placed it back gently, watching it tilt slightly to the side. A small symbol of an intention no longer needed. The kitchen around me hummed with its usual evening sounds, but they felt distant, softened, as though I were listening from another room. I pulled out a chair and sat at the table, hands folded loosely, eyes unfocused. The quiet pressed in gently, not suffocating but undeniably present. I realized how often I had oriented myself around their needs, their schedules, their feelings. And now in this absence, I felt the outline of myself more clearly. Not as someone slighted, but as someone suddenly visible to themselves. I traced the wooden grain of the table with one finger, grounding myself in the steady texture. The truth was simple. I wasn't included. And for the first time, I didn't rush to justify it or cushion the impact. I just let it be true. When I finally rose, the kitchen felt different. Not colder, not harsher, just more honest. I turned off the oven light, walked past the counter where the unused card still leaned, and paused before leaving the room. The air felt still, almost expectant, as if waiting for me to decide what came next. I didn't make any grand declarations. I didn't vow anything. I simply stepped away from the cake, the card, the ritual, and let the space remain empty where I once would have filled it without being asked. Sometimes, clarity arrives in the shape of an omission, and sometimes, that's all you need to begin. The bakery clerk asked me why I needed to cancel the cake order, her tone polite but curious. I paused, holding the phone between my shoulder and ear,
staring at the smudge of icing still lingering on the counter from where I'd set the unused box earlier. "The plan's changed," I said. 3 simple words. Clean. Unemotional. She apologized, processed the refund, and wished me a nice day. When the call ended, the kitchen felt strangely hollow, as if the absence of that small, familiar celebration had taken up more space than the event itself.
I leaned against the counter and let my fingers trace the faint cold ring the cake box had left behind. Loss doesn't always arrive with thunder. Sometimes it's just a quiet subtraction. My phone buzzed 3 times in quick succession, the vibrations steady and evenly spaced. For a moment, my chest tightened. The rhythm felt familiar. I turned it over, only to find messages from a work group chat, a delivery update, and a reminder for a bill I wouldn't be paying much longer. Not a single word from the family about the birthday. Not a follow-up. Not an explanation. I exhaled slowly through my nose, letting the air push out the heaviness lingering beneath my ribs. The pattern was becoming clear. When I asked questions, silence answered. When I pulled back, silence followed. Either way, silence remained their language. As I rinsed my hands under warm water, I caught the faint smell of vanilla frosting still clinging to my fingertips. It startled me, a scent so soft, so sweet, carrying a weight it didn't deserve. Memory is strange like that. A smell, a texture, a leftover gesture can tug at something inside you weren't ready to feel. I dried my hands on a dish towel and looked at my palms, imagining all the years of effort that had passed through them. Grocery bags, receipts, bills, birthday candles. How many celebrations had I orchestrated without being asked? How many moments had I made easier for them to enjoy? The ache wasn't sharp. It was a slow roll, like a tide pulling back farther than before. I moved to the table, opened my phone, and created a new entry in my ledger. A quiet record of things that didn't fit into budgets or timelines. I typed the date, the event, the exclusion. Then I added a note. Absence confirmed by silence. Not for vindication, not for evidence, just for clarity. Seeing it written made it real in a way thinking it never could. The house hummed around me, the familiar sounds shifting into background noise. I wasn't searching for blame. I wasn't rehearsing hurt. I was acknowledging the truth as it stood. I had been written out of something I had helped uphold. The faint scent of vanilla still lingered near the sink, drifting in soft waves as I moved around the kitchen. I let it come and go without resisting. Loss isn't just what you no longer have. It's also what you continue to feel after it's gone. I took a deep breath and stepped back, letting the quiet settle again. My reflection in the window above the sink looked steadier than I felt, calm, composed. No trace of the tension beneath my sternum. I placed both hands on the counter, grounding myself in the cool, smooth surface. Awareness had become a kind of companion now, not comforting but honest. When I finally walked out of the kitchen, I didn't look back at the cake box still sitting in the fridge, or the birthday card leaning unanswered by the fruit bowl. I didn't need to. The moment had already done its work. As I reached the doorway, something inside me settled, an understanding, a recognition, a boundary forming not from anger but from clarity. I no longer expected them to see the effort I gave. But I finally saw what their absence said in return. And sometimes that kind of seeing hurts. Sometimes it heals. And sometimes it does both at once. The next morning, I sat at the table with my laptop open and my bank account spread neatly across the screen. The numbers made sense in a way the relationships no longer did. I started with the easiest step, separating my finances from the household's. One by one, I changed the cards linked to each account, utilities, cable, internet, removing my information and replacing it with a placeholder until I could reach the providers directly. The cursor blinked calmly, waiting for each confirmation. I breathed deeply, not with dread, but with something firmer. A feeling like reclaiming ground I had quietly surrendered piece by piece. The kitchen was cool around me, the air still, as though holding open the space I needed to think clearly. I drafted an email template I planned to send to each provider after the changes were complete. The subject line was simple: Account Ownership and Authorization Update. The body even simpler: Please restore primary email access to me, the original account holder, and confirm changes in writing. No emotion, no justification, just the facts. I read it over once, twice, ensuring it was firm without being combative. It felt strange, empowering, in a way I hadn't allowed myself to feel in years. I clicked save. The laptop screen reflected back a steadiness I hadn't seen in a long time. I recognized myself in it. When I called the first provider, the representative asked me to verify the account details. My voice didn't waver. I answered each question with precision, reclaiming my place one sentence at a time. "We'll get your email reinstated immediately," she said kindly. Something lifted inside me. Almost imperceptible but unmistakable, like a knot loosening. When the confirmation email arrived seconds later, a small rush of breath left my chest. Not relief, something stronger. Alignment. Ownership returning to the hands it belonged to. I sat back in my chair, letting the tension slide down my shoulders. Outside, the day moved slowly. Neighbors walking dogs. A delivery truck rumbling down the street. Leaves shifting in the mild wind. The kitchen window framed it all in soft motion, a contrast to the stillness inside me. I glanced at the printed forms I needed to take to the shop later, the smell of fresh paper drifting up. Life, I realized, kept moving even when relationships stalled. I typed a few more notes, organizing tasks, outlining what needed to be done next. For the first time in a long while, the work felt like mine. Not something I was doing for others, but something I was doing to protect myself. I closed the laptop, smoothed my hands over the cover, and whispered quietly, "I've heard enough." The words weren't bitter, they weren't dramatic. They felt like a conclusion gently landing after a long, uneven story. I stood and pushed the chair back slowly, listening to the soft scrape of wood on tile. The kitchen felt brighter, though the light hadn't changed. Maybe it was just me, more awake, more present, more aware of the spaces where I had shrunk to fit expectations that were never mine to carry. Before leaving the room, I gathered the old statements into a neat stack and placed them into a folder marked for archiving. Not because I needed to hold on, but because I was finally letting go, with clarity, not resentment. As I slid the folder into the cabinet, a calm certainty settled into my ribcage. I wasn't waiting for an apology. I wasn't hoping for recognition. I was simply choosing myself. And sometimes, choosing yourself is the most honest form of strength you can offer to a life that has slowly forgotten your name. I spread the documents across the table the way someone might lay out puzzle pieces, deliberate, calm, without rushing toward any single conclusion. A fresh sheet of paper sat at the center, blank except for the title I wrote at the top: Household Financial Agreement. I wasn't drafting it for drama. I wasn't preparing ammunition. I was creating structure, something clear, something shared, something that would prevent the soft erosion of boundaries that had worn me down over the years. I listed each service: electricity, water, internet, cable, trash. Then next to each I added 2 clean columns: user and payer. Underneath that, due date, responsibility, late fee handling. It felt almost clinical but steadying. I wrote slowly, feeling each line anchor the next. When I reached the final section, non-payment policy, I paused, pen hovering. Then I wrote, 1 missed cycle equals temporary suspension until resolved. Plain, fair, necessary. I didn't add anything emotional. I didn't dress the language in apologies or disclaimers. I wrote it the way I wish they had spoken to me, directly, respectfully, with the assumption that clarity is a kindness. I leaned back and read what I'd drafted. It wasn't harsh. It wasn't punitive. It simply drew a line where there had been too much blur. The kitchen felt steady around me, the soft hum of the dishwasher like a quiet nod of approval. I picked up my phone and typed a short note to myself. Only pay when included in decisions. It wasn't a threat. It was a principle, one that had taken years to crystallize. My fingers tapped the screen without hesitation, and when I saved the note, a small chime echoed from the device. It sounded like affirmation rather than alarm. That small sound warmed me, a reminder that my choices didn't need external validation to be real. I moved the drafted agreement into a manila folder and smoothed my hand over its surface. The paper felt warm from my touch, grounded, ready. 2 alarms were added to my calendar next, one for the week before my planned cutoff date, another for the morning of. The reminders appeared in neat blocks, their shapes sharp against the soft glow of my phone screen. I stared at them for a moment, acknowledging how much of my life had once revolved around accommodating everyone else's schedules. Now these reminders were carved for me, for my boundaries, my peace, my clarity. I set the phone down and let the stillness wrap around me. There was no fear in these decisions, only intention. The kitchen clock ticked steadily above me as I wrote one final line on a small yellow sticky note and pressed it to the binder. Without agreement, no payment. The handwriting was clean, almost elegant in its simplicity. I placed the binder in front of me and watched the yellow note stand out against the white plastic. It didn't feel confrontational. It felt like truth. A truth I'd been circling for years without allowing myself to speak plainly. Now it sat there, undeniable, almost serene. I exhaled slowly, letting the calm settle into my shoulders. Before closing the folder, I reviewed the pages one last time, scanning every line with a deliberate, quiet pride. Not the kind that waits for applause, but the kind that grows when you finally advocate for yourself without shrinking. I gathered the papers, stacked them neatly, and slid them into the drawer. The soft thud of the folder settling into place echoed like a promise. To myself, from myself. I turned off the kitchen light and stood in the doorway for a moment, the air cool against my arms. I didn't feel heavy. I felt defined. Sometimes strength arrives not as a roar but as a well-drawn line. And tonight, that line was mine. I started with the electricity provider, dialing their customer service line while the afternoon sun stretched across the tile floor in long gold strips. When the representative picked up, I confirmed my identity, then requested the exact date and time I wanted all automatic payments stopped. 001 on the 1st, I said clearly. Please send written confirmation. The steadiness in my voice surprised even me. The representative read the cancellation code aloud, each digit clean and final, and I wrote it neatly in my ledger. When the call ended, the room felt different. Lighter, not emptier. The kind of lightness that comes when something tight inside you finally unclenches. I moved on to the water provider, then the gas, then the cable company. Each call followed the same rhythm. Verify, request, confirm. I wrote down every timestamp, every employee ID number, every confirmation code. The precision wasn't for them. It was for me. Proof that I had not acted on emotion but on intention. When the final provider emailed their formal verification, I printed it and placed it into a folder labeled Cutoff Documentation. The pages felt crisp in my hands, a quiet record of a choice I had delayed far too long. My breath deepened as I stacked them, a measured inhale I didn't need to rush. There was a moment, just a flicker, when I wondered whether I should tell them before the cutoff date. Whether it would be kinder to prepare them, explain myself, soften the blow. But the thought dissolved as quickly as it came. Kindness, I realized, had been my default for too many years, even when it drained me. This decision wasn't punitive. It wasn't emotional. It was simply correct. Necessary. I slid the last document into the folder and closed it with a gentle press. The kitchen seemed to echo its finality, the kind of echo you hear not in sound but in certainty. When I placed my phone on the counter, its screen lit up with a flurry of notifications from group chats I wasn't interested in. I swiped them away and turned the device to silent mode. The vibration stopped instantly, leaving a hum of quiet that felt almost medicinal. The room exhaled with me, as if relieved to no longer carry the weight of expectation. I tucked the phone into a drawer, not to hide but to rest. There was nothing urgent I needed to respond to, nothing that couldn't wait. The stillness that followed wasn't isolating, it was restorative. My hands no longer trembled when I reached for the next task. I picked up a pen and wrote a short note at the top of my ledger. All providers notified. All valves closed. I underlined it once, firmly. The ink settled into the paper with a confidence I recognized as my own. A soft wave of ease washed through me, not triumph, not relief, just quiet confirmation. I closed the ledger and smoothed my hand over its cover, the texture familiar and grounding. It felt good to hold something that reflected my intent instead of my resentment. Before leaving the kitchen, I stood for a moment and listened to the house. The refrigerator hum, the faint settling of the walls, the distant sound of a car passing outside. Ordinary noises, but they no longer felt like burdens I needed to tend to or systems I needed to maintain. They were just sounds. The house, for the first time in years, didn't feel like something I owed. I turned off the faucet I'd forgotten to tighten earlier and let the quiet fill the room. When I walked away, my steps felt certain, unweighted. A valve had closed, not in anger, but in clarity. And the silence that followed was finally my own. Leaving the family group chat took exactly 2 taps. One to open the settings, one to select leave conversation. No fireworks. No warning message asking if I was sure. Just an instant exit. The thread disappearing like a door quietly closing behind me. For a moment, I stood still in the kitchen, phone in hand, feeling the absence of that constant digital hum. The silence that replaced it wasn't cold or punishing. It felt intentional. Like stepping out of a room where everyone speaks over you anyway. I placed the phone face down on the counter and let the quiet settle into my chest. It didn't feel like abandonment. It felt like return. Back to myself. Next, I opened my email settings and drafted an auto-reply for the address they always used for urgent bill stuff. The message was short and clean. As of date, all automatic payments have been discontinued. Please direct any financial inquiries to my personal email. No softness, no cushioning. Just information, delivered with the same neutrality they had offered me. I read it once, then pressed save. A calm finality washed over me, the type that comes not from burning bridges, but from finally stepping off one you've held up alone for too long. Then came the message I knew might stir the most reaction. For all financial matters, please use my private email. Group chat inquiries will not be monitored. I typed it slowly, deliberately, not as a threat, just a boundary placed where one had never existed. After sending it, I smoothed my palm over the table, grounding myself in the cool wood grain. I didn't wait for replies. I didn't look for dots indicating someone was typing. Expectation had become a luxury I no longer spent energy on. I closed my laptop, the soft click echoing the clean break inside me. I opened my ledger, its next page blank for the first time in months. The emptiness looked surprisingly inviting, like a fresh stretch of road with no detours. I dated the top corner and wrote only one sentence. All ties regarding payment severed. Under it, I left space. Not for more evidence or justification, but for whatever clarity came next. I closed the book gently. The room around me felt thin, almost transparent, the afternoon light filtering through it like a soft veil. There was no trembling in my hands, no heaviness in my breath. Something inside me had already crossed the threshold. I checked the clock. 24 hours left until every auto-pay system clicked off for good. The countdown didn't scare me. If anything, it steadied me. The house felt unusually quiet, though nothing about it had changed. The refrigerator hummed. A neighbor's car door thudded outside. The wooden floor gave a small sigh under my shifting weight. Ordinary sounds. But they no longer felt like cues for responsibility. They were simply sounds, neutral, almost gentle, no longer asking anything of me. I leaned against the counter and let the awareness fill me. I had reached the point where there was no return to the version of myself who tolerated omission as necessity. As I turned off the kitchen light, my reflection in the oven door caught my eye, soft, calm, unburdened in a way I hadn't seen in years. The quiet wasn't empty. It was full of decision, full of a steadiness that didn't need to be explained or defended. I walked out of the room with slow, certain steps, leaving behind the version of me who always adjusted, always absorbed, always paid. Tonight I wasn't carrying anything that wasn't mine, and the stillness that followed me down the hallway felt like confirmation that I had finally chosen the right direction. I drafted the text twice before settling on a single line. No embellishments, no softened corners, no explanations meant to make anyone feel better. I sat at the dining table with the morning light drifting across the wood in thin, quiet stripes. The house was still, almost expectant, as though waiting to see what I would do next. I read the sentence one more time, tasting its simplicity. All automatic payments have been canceled. That was it. Clean. Precise. True. I hovered my thumb over the send button for a breath, not out of doubt, but out of recognition. This was the message that would shift the balance permanently. I exhaled, long and slow, and pressed send. The screen flashed once and the message sailed out of my hands. Afterward, I placed the phone face down on the table, letting the quiet return like a tide. I didn't reach for it again. The temptation to check for reactions tugged at me faintly, but I didn't answer it. There was nothing to gain from scanning for panic, guilt, or anger. None of those reactions would change the truth behind the message. I walked to the sink, rolled up my sleeves, and began rinsing a few dishes left from breakfast. The warm water wrapped around my hands, a comforting contrast to the cool draft drifting through the window above the faucet. The simple act grounded me. For once, I wasn't multitasking responsibility and emotion. I was just washing a plate. The phone buzzed once behind me, then again, then again. 3 notifications, each vibration evenly spaced, like the heartbeat of a moment waiting to break open. I glanced over my shoulder but didn't move toward the table. I kept my hands in the water, listening to the faint clatter of cutlery under the suds. When the buzzing stopped, the house felt oddly lighter, as though something pressure-heavy had finally lifted.
I dried my hands on a dish towel and walked back to the table, not to respond but simply to clear the space around me. I slid the phone aside, screen still dark, refusing to let urgency dictate my next step. I opened the cabinet beneath the sink and retrieved a fresh sponge, replacing the worn one without ceremony. Small resets matter. They mark the end of cycles as surely as decisions do. I wiped down the counter, the soft streaks of lemon-scented cleaner forming wide, smooth arcs. The motions felt deliberate, settling, almost ceremonial. I wasn't cleaning to make the house comfortable for others anymore. I was cleaning to make this moment mine. When I finished, I placed the sponge neatly by the sink and stood there for a moment, letting the quiet hum steady me.
This was what reclaiming your life sounded like. Gentle, unhurried, whole. Only after several minutes did I pick up the phone again, turning it over as casually as if checking the time. A miniature storm waited on the screen. Missed calls, group messages, a few attempts at urgency disguised as concern. I didn't open any of them. I didn't need to. The reactions were predictable. The pattern had always been clear. They noticed my presence only when it threatened to disappear. I locked the screen again and slid the phone into the drawer beside the ledger. Out of sight, out of reach, out of the old rhythm. I breathed in deeply, letting the air expand my chest, steady and warm. When the kitchen finally settled into silence, I turned toward the sink, rinsed the last dish, and placed it gently on the drying rack. Steam rose in thin threads, catching the soft light spilling across the counter. I paused, feeling the warmth on my face. This moment, simple as it was, felt like standing in a doorway between two lives, the one I'd lived out of obligation, and the one I was beginning to claim with intention. As I dried my hands on a clean towel, a clarity washed over me. I wasn't severing ties. I was severing the weight that had kept me from breathing freely. And as I stepped away from the sink, I felt lighter. Not triumphant, not defiant, just free, in a way that settled instead of swelled. The missed calls stacked themselves like fallen dominoes across my screen. 8, then 12, then more. Each one marked with the same anxious urgency, as if repetition could force me back into the role I had quietly stepped out of. I didn't answer. I sat at the kitchen table sipping lukewarm tea, letting the notifications buzz against the drawer where I'd tucked the phone. The sound was muffled enough to feel distant, irrelevant, like rain hitting a roof I no longer lived under. I breathed in the soft herbal scent rising from the mug, letting it anchor me in the present rather than the chaos outside it. Silence, I realized, was no longer something that happened to me. It was something I chose. Eventually, I pulled the phone out, not to respond, but to document. One by one, I opened the missed calls, took screenshots, noted the timestamps, and archived everything into a labeled folder. This wasn't pettiness, it was clarity. If they needed to escalate, if they wanted to twist the narrative, I wanted the trail to be clean, factual, free of emotion. After saving each image, I typed a single message into the family thread. I'll respond when there is a clear, written proposal of responsibilities and contributions. No apology, no softness. Just an invitation to operate with the structure they had resisted for years. My thumb hovered over the send button for only a second. Then the message went out, blue and crisp against the background. Within moments, the typing dots appeared, fast, frantic, disappearing and reappearing like a stuttering heartbeat. I didn't wait to see what they were composing. Their panic wasn't mine to manage. Instead, I placed the phone on the far end of the table and returned to sorting a stack of grocery receipts I'd been meaning to discard. The mundane task steadied me, the soft crinkle of paper grounding me more than any argument ever could. As I sorted, I listened to the rhythm of my own breathing. Slow, even. Nothing in me felt shaken. For the first time, their urgency didn't translate into responsibility. The space between their expectations and my actions had widened into something solid, a boundary shaped not by anger, but by necessity. I folded each receipt into a small square and placed them neatly into the recycling bin. The simplicity of the motion soothed me. Life didn't need to feel heavy just because they had tossed their weight onto it. The phone buzzed again, longer this time, as a message ballooned across the screen. I opened it, not out of anxiety, but out of a quiet readiness. The message was long, defensive, full of explanations that skimmed the surface without touching accountability. I read it slowly, letting each line pass through me without sticking. When I finished, I took a screenshot, archived it, and typed, "Thank you for sharing. I'll review when there's a specific proposal, not emotional reactions." Then I hit send. The distinction mattered. I wasn't refusing dialogue, I was refusing chaos. I placed the phone back into the drawer, allowing it to buzz unanswered if it wanted to. The kitchen felt warm, softly lit, the late afternoon sun brushing against the countertops. I stood for a moment in the calm, absorbing the quiet like someone finally stepping out of a storm. The world hadn't ended because I stopped carrying what wasn't mine. The house hadn't collapsed because I stepped back. Nothing had shattered. What remained was simple, steady, mine. And as the refrigerator hummed its low, even song, I realized the echo of consequences didn't belong to me anymore. I had done my part. Now it was their turn to meet the reality they had long ignored. They asked to meet in person, insisting it would clear the air. I agreed, not out of obligation, but because clarity deserved a physical space. We sat around the dining table, one I had polished, repaired, and paid for over the years. The familiarity of the room almost softened the tension, but not enough to blur the truth hanging between us. My brother spoke first. "You're overreacting. It's family. Why make things so rigid?" His voice carried frustration and a touch of disbelief, as if the concept of boundaries were an unfamiliar language he'd never needed to learn. I kept my hands folded on the table, steady. "Rigid is what you call clarity when you're used to benefiting from the blur," I said quietly. I opened the ledger before them, not dramatically, not to accuse, but to present facts. 5 years of payments, adjustments, late-night fixes and quiet interventions. I turned the pages slowly, letting each number speak where words would only twist. "This is everything I've covered," I explained. "Every month, every expense, every correction." Their eyes moved reluctantly across the columns. The room thickened with a mix of discomfort and dawning recognition. Defensiveness flickered across my sister-in-law's face. "We didn't ask you to," she began. I raised a hand gently. "You didn't stop me either. And you benefited from it every single month." I slid a clean sheet of paper forward, the agreement I'd drafted. They stared at it as if I'd placed a foreign object on the table. "These are the terms," I said. "Clear roles, clear responsibilities, clear consequences." My voice never wavered. I wasn't pleading. I wasn't persuading. I was informing. If you want shared services, you contribute. If you want control over accounts, you handle the payments. If you want collaboration, you communicate. My brother leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. "You're acting like a landlord." I met his eyes calmly. "No. I'm acting like an adult who refuses to be used." The silence that followed stretched long and taut. The wall clock ticked loudly in the background, marking each second of their processing. I didn't fill the space. I didn't rush them. The truth needed room to settle. My sister-in-law finally spoke, her voice subdued. "So, what happens if we don't sign this?" I didn't sugarcoat it. "Then there are no shared services, no shared accounts, no implied obligations. Everyone handles their own." I watched the words sink into them, replacing the misconceptions they had leaned on for years. The air felt clearer, not kinder, but truthful. I folded the ledger gently and placed it beside me. "I'm willing to move forward," I said, "but only if it's built on respect, not assumption." Their eyes dropped to the agreement again, its clean lines waiting for signatures that meant more than ink. I remained still, letting them sit with it. The tension in the room wasn't mine to resolve. It never had been. As I waited, the only sound came from the soft hum of the refrigerator and the distant passing of a car outside. Ordinary noises. Honest noises. Life continuing, whether they rose to meet this moment or not. I gathered my jacket and stood. You don't need to decide now, I added. But whatever choice you make will determine the structure of our relationship going forward. Their faces softened, not in agreement but in recognition. A shift, a beginning, maybe an ending. I stepped away from the table, feeling the weight lift from my shoulders. I didn't need them to choose today. I only needed them to understand the choice was real. And as I opened the front door to leave, the cool air met my skin like a quiet affirmation. I had stopped negotiating my worth the moment I started defining it. The next morning arrived without ceremony. No apologies, no sudden clarity from them. But the house felt different anyway, lighter, as if the air had shifted to make room for something new. I brewed a small pot of coffee for myself and let the steam rise in slow, steady ribbons. As I sipped, my phone lit up with a message from my brother. We called the providers. We'll take over the accounts. Short, bare, practical. A second message followed from my sister-in-law. We'll budget for the cable and kids' channels. Thanks for handling it this long. I read the words twice, trying to detect tone. There wasn't warmth exactly, but there was acknowledgement, a beginning. Not enough to erase anything, but enough to move forward without dragging the past behind me. A little later, my mother sent a separate text. Let me cover the cable this month. You've done more than enough. Her message was softer, laced with a tenderness that made something ease inside my chest. I replied with a simple, thank you, I appreciate that. Not out of obligation, not out of habit, but because gratitude, when genuine, deserved to be met with grace. I set the phone down, letting the gesture settle between us like a small, fragile bridge. A bridge built not from guilt or expectation, but from recognition. That alone made it worth noting. With the house still quiet, I turned to the stove and began making a simple breakfast. Eggs, butter melting slowly across a pan, the faint sizzle softening the edges of the morning. Cooking for one felt peaceful in a way I hadn't experienced in years. No rush to match someone else's schedule. No quiet resentment simmering beneath tasks no one noticed. This meal belonged entirely to me. My pace, my taste, my moment. I plated the eggs and sat by the window watching the day unfold. In small movements outside, a jogger passing, a neighbor watering her plants, sunlight gathering on the sidewalks. Ordinary scenes, but today they felt grounding. The scent of warm butter filled the kitchen, soft and comforting. And as I ate, I felt myself unclench slowly, like a muscle long tensed, finally remembering how to rest. Change didn't always shout. Sometimes it arrived in the form of an unshared breakfast, a peaceful morning, the absence of a burden you once believed was permanent. I took another slow bite, letting the silence stretch gently around me. It wasn't loneliness. It was space. Space I had earned. Space I had waited for. Space that finally felt like mine. After breakfast, I rinsed the plate and placed it carefully in the drying rack, letting the warm water run across my fingers. The simplicity of it felt almost symbolic. A single dish, one person's mess, one person's responsibility. No invisible labor, no emotional calculus. Just a clean plate and a quiet sink. When I straightened, a soft breeze drifted through the slightly open window, brushing my shoulder with a cool whisper. I stood for a moment, letting the breeze settle into my skin, gentle and certain. the kind of touch that didn't ask anything of me. I opened the window wider, allowing the morning air to fill the room more fully. Outside, the world moved with its usual rhythm. Inside, the order of things had changed. Not loudly, not dramatically, but unmistakably. I felt it in the way my body stood straighter, in the settled ease between my ribs, in the sense that life had finally shifted into alignment with the boundaries I'd drawn. Quiet victories aren't always seen by others, but they are felt, deeply. And as I leaned against the counter, taking in the quiet sweep of the kitchen, I realized something simple and true. I had stepped back, and the world hadn't fallen apart. It had rearranged itself around fairness, around accountability, around respect. And in that soft reordering, I finally found room to breathe. The next morning, the kitchen woke before I did. When I walked in, the overhead light glowed exactly on time, neither early nor late, steady in a way that felt almost symbolic. I stood beneath it for a moment, letting the warm brightness settle across my shoulders. This was the first day in years where I wasn't calculating bills before my coffee brewed. The first morning where duty didn't tug at me the moment my feet touched the floor. I set a small pot on the stove and cracked eggs into a bowl, whisking them slowly as the house rested in its calm. There was no urgency, no mental tally running beneath my thoughts, just the soft rhythm of morning. And for the first time in a long while, it felt like enough. After breakfast, I logged into my personal accounts, only mine now, and paid the electricity bill for my own space. The numbers were simple, clean, unshared. I clicked confirm and felt something settle in my chest, like a quiet exhale I hadn't realized I'd been holding for years. Responsibility didn't feel heavy anymore. It felt rightful, appropriate, proportionate. I closed the laptop, appreciating the ease of a world containing only the obligations I willingly chose. No blurred lines, no hidden expectations, just clarity. The kind that doesn't flare or demand attention. It just rests, steady and honest. I drafted a short message and saved it without sending. Whenever you're ready to discuss shared responsibilities, write out a clear proposal. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't even a boundary anymore. It was simply the truth, as gentle as it was firm. I deleted the draft. I didn't need to send it. If they wanted conversation, they knew how to find me. And if they didn't, silence would no longer feel like rejection. It would feel like space, growth, autonomy. I slid the phone aside and walked across the kitchen, my steps unhurried. The sunlight brushing over the floor in warm, soft rectangles. I reached for the binder I once guarded like a second spine. Pages of receipts, statements, schedules, and silent responsibilities. I opened the drawer beneath the counter, placed the binder inside, and pushed it all the way to the back. Not hidden, not discarded. Just stored where it belonged, in the past. The drawer closed with a muted thud, and the quiet afterward felt almost ceremonial. A completion, not an ending. A loop closed, not severed. I rested my hand on the countertop for a moment, feeling the smooth surface beneath my palm. Light pooled gently around the edges, soft and unobtrusive. The kitchen air felt clean when I inhaled, as though the room itself had unclenched. The refrigerator hummed. A neighbor's dog barked faintly outside. The world carried on at its own pace, finally matching the rhythm I had claimed for myself. I stood still, letting the peace wash through me. Not triumphant, not vindicated, simply intact. Whole in a way I hadn't been while carrying the weight of a family that never learned to divide it. As I stepped away from the counter, a warm stripe of sunlight slid across the table, illuminating its grain in a soft golden sweep. I paused to take it in, not as a symbol, not as a message, but as a quiet truth. Life rearranges itself around clarity, around boundaries, around choices made calmly and held steadily. I smiled, not wide, not loud, just enough to acknowledge how far I had come. Then, I walked out of the kitchen, the light trailing gently behind me, carrying with it the peace of finally, fully letting go. In the end, nothing collapsed when I stepped back. The house kept standing, the bills found new hands, and the silence that once felt heavy finally softened into something peaceful. I didn't slam any doors or deliver dramatic speeches. I simply chose myself, quietly, steadily, in ways that didn't need applause to feel true. And somehow, that calm choice echoed louder than any confrontation ever could. The kitchen light still turns on every morning. But now it shines on a life that belongs fully to me. My time, my money, my boundaries, my breath. I no longer move through the house as an invisible current. I exist in my own rhythm. And the peace that comes with that is something I won't hand over again. Maybe that's the lesson tucked inside all of this. Sometimes, you don't need to win. Sometimes, you just need to stop carrying what was never meant to be yours. If this story touched you, or reminded you of a moment in your own life, leave a comment below and tell me what part stayed with you. And if you want more stories like this one, quiet but powerful, don't forget to subscribe to the channel.